need to talk a little bit about what actually ending abortion would do. In other words, would it actually reduce any abortion rates at all? Because I've heard the claim a lot that it won't, that just, eliminating abortion legally will mean the exact same number of abortions keep happening. So, Josh, what do you think about that claim?
Yeah, so there's this weird thing where there's actually pro-choice people that have literally told me on campuses that their argument for keeping abortion legal, even if we're right about the unborn, is that if you make abortion legal, the exact same number of abortions are going to keep happening. And the only difference will be that presumably there will at least be some more women who die because abortion has become more dangerous. And so it's basically like if you're pro life, then you should be for fewer people being killed. And even if you're right about the unborn, like you shouldn't make it more dangerous for women. And I'm like, are you high? That's not what I say. That's too snarky. But it's just like, look, like that's just not realistic. You actually think that all women will like disobey the law? Like that is not what you saw pre-Roe. You saw the abortion rate basically double in years after Roe versus Wade, which tells us something. It tells us that there were women in the late 60s and the early 70s who were morally willing to have an abortion, but were not willing to disobey the law. And then the abortion rate went way up after abortion became legal. And then it has been on a downward trend, but basically since the 90s. It's now the abortion rate now is actually lower than it was before Roe versus Wade, which is maybe one of the reasons why a lot of people in society just don't care that much about the abortion issue anymore on both sides. It's just less connected to a lot of people's kind of everyday lives. But for sure, it's like there are going to be a lot of women who will obey the law, and it seems weird to suggest that most of them will. Now, of course, as we kind of mentioned earlier, like the abortion rate is not massively changing this week because okay, so you've got some states that have trigger laws that were like, okay, we're going to become this like pro-life state or a fairly pro-life state if Roe versus Wade ever gets overturned. But most of those trigger laws are in red states. And those are the states that have the fewest abortions. And so I've seen an estimate that probably like the abortion rate would maybe be affected 10, 15% after Roe versus Wade, but not like this kind of a massive, kind of bigger number that like you hear like a lot of pro-choice people thinking. And so, Andrew, jump in. I know that you had some thoughts on this.
Yeah, there's there's a point on this that kind of gets me a little riled up, which is the idea that I know Planned Parenthood v. Casey is gone now; it's dead law. But let's talk about Casey for a second. Let's talk about the undue burden standard, which is this whole idea that if there's a pro-life law, it poses a burden on women's ability to exercise their constitutional rights to get an abortion. And the burden is presumes to be like a meaningful burden. It's not just, oh, it costs 10 more dollars. It's, oh, some women, maybe a lot of women, aren't going to be able to get an abortion because they have to drive another 100 miles or because the only facility in the state just closed. That's what they mean by undue burden here. And the pro-choice lawyers have spent so much money and so much time fighting every little piece of pro-life legislation. And so it becomes very hard for me to believe that they have been arguing something they believe to be so false, that these undue burdens are not going to have any meaningful effect on the number of abortions. If having a regulation about the width of the hallway and the ability for two beds to pass each other in the hallway is an undue burden that would cause some women to not have abortions, then it only stands to reason that a ban in a state would reduce the number of abortions. I'm just trying to take the pro-choice lawyers at their word here. And so it's this idea that the law changing doesn't have any meaningful results flies in the face of the rhetoric we've been told for the last 49 years.
And we've also literally seen the abortion rate go down when there's been any sort of restrictions on this. Like, a lot of people claim we have no statistics on this. We do. Secular Pro-Life is the most amazing place for compiling all sorts of research. And so I'm going to throw up on the screen a resource from them, an article that I encourage you to go take a look at. And I'm also going to throw the link to it in the chat. And basically what they have done is combined a bunch of research studies about what happens in different areas when there is some sort of ban or restriction on abortion that's put in place. And they're trying to figure out, is actually putting a restriction reducing the number of abortion rates? So you can take that down, Tim. I threw the link in the chat as well if people want to go look further. But the whole idea is that you can go hypothetically have a secret abortion, right? But you can't have a secret birth. And so what they try to do is compare the birth rate to what it was before there was a restriction. Because hypothetically, if we had a birth rate of X and then we put a restriction on abortion in and people kept having the same exact number of abortions, the birth rate shouldn't change, right? Because the same number of pregnancies are being terminated. But that's not what happened. The birth rate went up every single time, which leads you to believe that the reason that's happening is because fewer people are able to get an abortion. That's the only thing that changed in that area, was suddenly there was this restriction on abortion, and so now people are having more children. So we do have some sorts of statistics looking at what has actually happened in our country and around the world whenever these restrictions have been put in place. The last little piece of this that's important to say is, even if we assume that it is true, that nothing will change. Like, if everything that Andrew and Josh and I just talked about is a lie, and it is true that absolutely no numbers of how many people are having abortions will change, I still think that we should make abortion illegal. And here's why. If abortion is the killing of innocent people, like if it is the human rights violation that I believe it to be, then it makes sense why I want it to be illegal. Because the law is essentially a moral teacher. Like, by overturning Roe v. Wade, that's a huge step to our society essentially unlearning that it's okay to kill humans while they're yet unborn, and instead learning that all humans have and deserve equal protection from violence. Even the law just considering Dobbs, like this whole past springtime, when there was this big question about what the Supreme Court is going to do, that made a significant number of students on the college campuses where we were doing outreach become more unsure about their opinion on abortion. Josh and I are actually just about to record a podcast on this, so I don't know when it'll be coming out, but we're going to talk about some of the crazy outreach stories we've had from doing outreach over this past year, because with abortion being talked about more in society over the last year, we had some wild things happen at our college campus outreaches. And I just want to tell you about one of those things, which is this idea that we saw more people voting in our little poll on the "it depends" option than ever before. If you're not familiar with how ERI does poll tables, when we go to a college campus and start having dialogues about abortion, we put this table out, and we have a question on the table that says, should abortion remain legal in the US? We're going to have to change that question now. But we have, should abortion remain legal in the US? And then we would have a yes, a no, and an "it depends" in the middle. And then we'd have some sort of voting mechanism, way for students to show whether they wanted to say yes, no, or "it depends." And I'll be perfectly honest, for years, the "it depends" was just there to like show that we were open to nuanced answers. No one ever actually picked "it depends." No one. Maybe you get like one student the whole outreach who would pick "it depends."
5% at most.
Yeah. At most 5%. And suddenly, specifically this spring, the "it depends" jar went crazy. It was nuts to me. I was just on a meeting with one of my affiliate groups down in Illinois, and they had the exact same thing happen, and I haven't even been to their campus. Like, they were doing outreach all by themselves, and they did an outreach right at the end of the school year, kind of like right before Dobbs came out, essentially, you know, in May-ish, and they had 100 students take their poll that afternoon, and 27 out of 100, almost a third of the students, answered "it depends." And we were just completely mind blown. And from the conversations we had with students who chose "it depends, and the conversations that my affiliate groups had with all of their students on their campuses who had chosen "it depends, it was very much tied to this idea that they weren't sure what the law was going to be. They had become intrigued, not that they were necessarily going to have their view be tied to what was in the law. That wasn't the case. But because this wasn't just a settled issue anymore, now they weren't sure what they thought, because they had been living their whole lives with the position of, well, of course I'm pro-choice because that's just what the law is. Like, I've never had to think about this. That's just my default. And now that the law was potentially going to change, they were just sitting there being like, I don't know what I think anymore. And it depends wasn't really an it depends. It was more like a, I'm not sure what my position is, so I'll put it here and then talk to you. Just purely because they had never actually had to think about this before. And so I think that proves right there that the law is a moral teacher. And so it's really important that we are doing things that are going to create this cultural conversation. I also think that based on everything we know, banning abortion is likely to stop the majority of abortions. Outside of women being like flown into states like California for free, we're still going to stop a lot of abortions. And it's going to have a compounding effect over time as more and more people start having these conversations with our college campus. They start unlearning that it's okay to kill humans while they're yet unborn. And making abortion illegal, if nothing else, will have that effect where we start having these conversations and we start to be affected by the laws in how we think.